Hi, this is Patrick Juhlin from AZ Billiards doing a Southwest cue review. This is my collection of Southwest cues I wanted to go over and talk a little bit about the cues and the history of Southwest and kind of why they're so sought after. What you're looking at in front of you, left to right, is a Kerschen-brought cue, a DPK cue. David Kerschen-brought is the gentleman that taught Jerry Franklin how to build pool cues, back in the 80s, early 80s from what I understand. It's a solid purple heart, curly purple heart, Kerschen-brought cue that I picked up about a year and a half ago from Kamal Daswani in Hong Kong. The one to the right of that is a Jerry Franklin cue. The one to the right of that is another Jerry Franklin cue. And basically all four of those on the right hand side are Jerry Franklin cues pre-1995 and 96 before he passed away. So I'll get a little pan view of the cues and their whole entire view. So all the cues that I collect are typically rare. I typically don't buy anything or try to collect anything that's kind of plain Jane, anything like that. Just preference, collectability, something rare's to me a little bit nicer and has an interesting story behind each of them. I picked up the Kerschen-brought cue because I wanted to see how these cues played in relationship to Southwest cues, because they were essentially kind of the fundamentals of DPK cues always come out in Southwest cues because of the connection between David Kerschen-brought and Jerry Franklin. So I love that cue. It's just an interesting cue. It was refinished by Ed Young and Kerschen-brought about 5 years ago. The cue was supposedly made in 1992 and refinished. They did a great job, though. It's a very interesting cue. I'll grab it and show it to you. Get in focus. So this cue, you can see, has got the DPK roller logo. That's kind of a neat deal, and you can see the curly purple heart in there. It's got rings in all positions. Get the focus dialed in here, sorry about that. It's kind of cool. It came with the DPK Roller K joint protectors, which is really unique. From my knowledge, there's only a few of those around, but if somebody has more knowledge, please post on this and update the information. So, okay, I'll get us back in focus here. Okay, so the second cue is a Southwest cue, and at first glance it looks really, really simple, really normal. There's probably 1,000 bird's eye maple forearm ebony point cues that look very, very similar to this. I'll show down to the butt. Really simple, very simple. What makes this cue super unique, probably one, if not the second most rarest Southwest I've ever owned or seen, is this fact, and I'll hold the cue up to show you. What it has is it's got 6 high points. Most Southwest cues are traditional in the fact that they've got 3 high points and 3 low points. What makes this cue really unique that drew me to it is the fact that it has 6 high ebony points. I've seen a tulip wood wrapless Southwest that has 6 high. I've seen, I think, another tulip wood ebony nose that has a wrap 6 high, but that's about it. I know there's a handful out there, but they're super, super rare, and this is a really, really cool cue. It's a pre-date. I believe it was made in 1989. I've got a letter of authenticity with that, but that's a really, really unique cue and one I love and cherish. So the cue next to that is another unique cue. It's got an interesting story behind it. It is unique in the sense it's a satin pointed cue, if that makes sense to you. Essentially, it's a cue what someone would qualify as a Southwest pacifier cue, which is a cue that they used to give people temporarily while they were waiting for their main cue to be built. Typically, pacifier cues or satin cues are made of a solid bird's eye forearm, no rings, no nothing, just as plain Southwest as they come. So the story behind this cue, a friend of mine, Mike Massey, and his wife, Francine, they live in Park City, Utah. I live in Salt Lake, and they had recently moved back here. And Mike came over to play one day and brought some cues to show me. And one of the cues he brought me was this satin Southwest cue. And it was actually his wife's cue, so I offered her a price on it, and she accepted it. And it's kind of an interesting story. She was having a fancy Southwest cue built back in 1993 and 94. The wait was taking some time, so she essentially had Jerry Franklin and Lori Franklin build this cue for her. But it's really, really unique for a few different reasons. One, it's got a satin finish. That's unique. Two, it's got two dark woods with no veneer, so you can barely see those ebony points. 3 high, 3 low. The other unique part about it is that it was made in 1994 during the time when Southwest first started putting cactuses on their pin. Now, for a small batch and a small run of pacifier cues, the plain Jane bird's eye maple cues they make, they put the Southwest cactus pin in there with no serial number. And I'll show you that right now. Let's see if I can get this focused. So as you can see with this cue, you can probably barely see, but you'll notice there's a cactus there. Well, there's no serial number. And from my knowledge, and I'm going to have Lori verify this for me, and anybody else can certainly verify this if there's others out here like this, but as far as what I've seen, this is the only cue that is pointed, that has a single cactus, no pin, that's considered a pacifier cue. I mean, I've heard of some satin finish pointed cues before, but this is unique in a few different ways because it has a cactus with no serial number on it, which classifies it as a pacifier cue, yet it has 6 points, 3 high, 3 low, ebony. Another unique feature, it's got a really long butt sleeve, a little bit longer than normal. Focus that for you. Beautiful, beautiful cue. It's a little bit lighter and it's a little bit skinnier. And I think, my imagination probably tells me that was done because Francine's a woman and she wanted a little bit skinnier cue because she's got smaller hands. So anyways, this is kind of a unique cue in a few different respects. Boy, you can barely see those points. So that's a really cool cue. Like that cue. So the next cue is my playing cue. And this is a cue I picked up in just south of San Francisco when I was there on a business trip about 3 years ago. But it's a 1994 ebony nose Southwest, single red veneer with cocobolo points. And this is my playing cue and will probably be my playing cue for the rest of my life. I don't know what it is about it. I just think it's balanced great and something about the ebony nosed Southwest cues that make them great playing cues. Love it. It's just top notch all the way around. Nothing too special about it other than it's an ebony cue and it's a Jerry Franklin, which most of you guys are that know Southwest cues. Ebony knows Southwest cues, whether they're Jerry Franklin era cues, 1996 and before, or whether they're 1996 to date, are some of the most sought after collector cues in the market. So ebony, and I'm certainly a fan myself. I think the ebony is a little bit denser up front, and Southwest shafts are typically stiffer in general. So the way they play and the way they hit just tend to play and bounce a little bit better for me. Kind of move the cue ball around with a little more ease. So the fifth and last cue is a really wild cue and unique for Southwest for a few different reasons. This is a cue I picked up in LA about 4 or 5 months ago, and the guy that had the cue, his story was that he brought it to Jerry Franklin back in the early 80s to Jerry's house in Las Vegas, Nevada, and had a cue commissioned by Jerry, and he actually brought the pieces of wood with him that he had the cue made out of. So this cue is really unique for a couple of reasons. One, it's an African blackwood forearm, and I mean, in talking to Laura, she said there's probably only 2 or 3 cues in the whole entire world where Southwest use African blackwood as a forearm. It's not something that you can get that's on their typical wood selection list. It's super rare. The other thing in addition to this that makes it really rare is that it's got snakewood points. Now Southwest typically doesn't even use snakewood. It's really not an option unless you get a fancy cue. So those two woods in combination, on top of the fact it's a Jerry Franklin, on top of the fact that the guy brought his own pieces of wood in to have Jerry commission a cue for him, makes it super rare. It's a little bit longer cue. It's about 60 inches. It's just a beautiful cue. It's a monster cue in regards to how it hits. I mean, it moves the cue ball around the table effortlessly and has a lot of characteristic to go with it. But this cue is just beautiful. I'll show this to you. Kind of hard to see the figure in the wood with the light. Snakewood points, single natural veneer, and then an African blackwood forearm. It's dark with this light, so you probably can't even see the figure in the African blackwood, and I'll get a different angle. Show you the butt end. Really cool cue. So another cool thing about that African blackwood snakewood point cue is it came with 2 shafts, the 2 that are right beside the cue, and they're both 13mm full shafts, and they have the original old Westinghouse micarta ferrules on them, which is another rarity in its own right. They just discontinued making Westinghouse micarta because of how it's manufactured. I'm not sure the exact details. I've heard some people suggest that there's asbestos in the process of making the Westinghouse micarta, which is why they discontinued making it. But in general, you know, I started playing pool about 5.5, 6 years ago. And when I started playing, I think about a year after that in 2008, I became part of the AZ Billiards community, and I kept seeing people talk about Southwest cues, and I couldn't figure out why they're so expensive. I couldn't figure out why everybody loved them so much. But obviously, you know, if a large group of people, think that they're amazing cues and are willing to wait 10 to 11 years to get them, I decided to make my own investment in one and try them out. So I've owned about 12 Southwest cues over the past 3.5, 4 years when I started buying them, and they certainly live up to their name. Now, they're not all exotic in the sense of the inlays and ring work and all that stuff, but what they are is they're consistent. Their building quality and the way they standardize their building process is amazing and very consistent, and they're some of the best playing cues I've ever played with. I've had black boars, I've had Kerschen-broughts, as you can see, I've had Lambros cues, I've had, boy, I mean, that's just to start a name of a long list of different cues I've owned and tried, but certainly an amazing cue, and well worth the value that they cost, and certainly worth the wait. I think that's part of the value is they have a limited production run. The wait's 10 to 11 years depending on what kind of cue you get, and they always produce a good quality cue. So that's my review.